Hello, my name's Ian MacDonald Nethercott. I'm one of the emergency medicine consultants at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. And the talk I'm going to give here is about how to do the kind of quality improvement project that you need to carry out for your FRCEM submission. There's many ways to do quality improvement in general, but the college particularly wants you to undertake a particular style of project. And I think it's so that you are trained in how to use the kinds of tools you need to tackle a project that you really do not know how to solve from the beginning. The sort of project where you just do not know where even to begin. The structure of the talk is like this. I'll give a few thoughts on the general mindset and approach to setting up a project, picking a suitable project, and the kind of timelines you're looking at and what that really means for you. And then when we get into actually how to run a project, there's four key phases. There's the preparation, identifying and designing interventions that you can use, then selecting some and implementing them, and then finally writing it up. And then I'll close with a few thoughts about how you might spot the kind of quality improvement project that will be suitable for you and others that would not be suitable. I've never yet managed to give this talk in less than an hour and a quarter. So I recommend that you get yourself comfortable, find somewhere there's peace and quiet, get yourself a cup of tea like me, and we'll get started. Okay, so here's where you start. You start with the right mindset, understanding that quality improvement, as we want you guys to do it for your FRCEM, is as simple as following a recipe. It's a methodological process, and it doesn't require you to be a creative genius or a management guru. It's a sequence of standardized, small and fairly easy steps that if you follow, you'll be able to come up with some really good, really practical solutions to a problem that you're given. And a key understanding is that it's not research. You don't have to start with the perfect project all designed before you even begin. It does not have to be perfect. It's iterative, so you can start and learn, go back and try again as many times as you need to. But it's not just making it up as you go. We have a very solid framework to apply, and there are several, and the one that we conventionally use in medicine and that I really recommend that you just start off with is called the model for improvement. When you start reading about model for improvement, you'll see that it says it's designed to answer three questions. What are we trying to achieve? How will we know when we've achieved it? And what changes can we make? And yeah, that's absolutely what it's about. But there's very many more specific steps in the sequence that you need to follow. There are other methodologies out there, particularly developed in other industries. Lean, for example, that's a process to try and identify and reduce waste in a process. Or Kotter's 8 steps, that's more about large-scale cultural change in big organizations. They're both incredibly useful and practical and successful. But for us, model for improvement is what we think you should use. And then start with the right SMART goals. It takes a while to do a quality improvement project. And as a rule of thumb, I would say however long or short you take, it's going to be about 50% of all the time will be spent on preparation, and then the other 50% on actually implementation. Of course, that is just a rough rule of thumb. Right now, I am supervising an FY2 resident who's going through who's implementing a QI project really very much faster. But of course, it's something that's really simple to do. The kind of projects I think we're expecting from a higher specialty trainee will take longer, and you should expect that. You're really looking at, in general, probably 6 months, beginning to end. And if my slide will advance, here is a fairly useful map for you in terms of timelines. Okay, so let's start when you need to finish your project. You will know roughly when your next ARCP date is going to be. You know that you need to submit your project 1 month before that ARCP. So there you go. That's the day it goes in. How long does it take to write it? Probably 3 or 4 weeks. Let's say 4 weeks. So you need to finish your last intervention and data collection 2 months before your final ARCP. Each cycle tends to take between 2 and 4 weeks, depending on how simple it is. I think you should start at the outset assuming that it's going to take 4 weeks per cycle. You're going to want to do 2 or 3 cycles. And then before you even get started on your solutions and interventions, you have a lot of preparatory work. Like I said, it's probably about 50% of the entire time of the project. So you're really looking at a minimum of 8 weeks or so. And then before the preparatory work, there's exploratory work where, you come up with an idea and then you explore whether or not it's actually a viable project. So it's simple maths to figure out when is the last sensible time that you should be aiming to start your project. Well, and between now and then, that's the time you've got to figure out what project you're going to do. I think this is incredibly powerful and incredibly useful to set this out really on paper. But the day you say to yourself, I need to do a quality improvement project, okay, this is the first thing to do, your timeline. That gives you an estimate of how much time you've got to figure out what project you're going to do. And I think it's probably worth saying here now too, it's difficult to find a project. The idea that you can land in a new department, look around for a couple of weeks, find something that you don't think works very well and fix it. I mean, it is, some people manage it if you have luck and you hit on something that is amenable. But if you're unlucky and you don't really hit on that thing, the next thing to do is just to go to the department leads and say, folks, what do you need fixing that is realistic and reasonable that I could do in my time here? There's a lot of benefits to doing that. Don't lean so much on what you're interested in. Lean on what's achievable. My slides aren't moving. Okay, then the next key part of planning your timeline, and this is really important, I think, because I've seen people lose whole years with a project that went wrong that they stuck with for too long. The key point here is identify some backout dates. That is a date where you're going to say, if my project hasn't progressed sufficiently by this date, I'm going to stop. Or at least I'm going to go to my ES and say, if we can't solve this right now, it's time for me to stop, because this project is going so slowly that I'm not going to get it done in the time I have available. And I need to get out and find a new project that is achievable. And humans have a bias. Once we commit to something, we tend to stick with it for far too long. And I've seen that in people who own dodgy cars that are costing hundreds every month to get repaired, when they should just get rid of it and get a new car. And people who've embarked on quality improvement projects that are really unrealistic, that they're going to achieve it in the time that they have, and they stick with it for far too long and run down the clock, and before they know it, it's time to move on and they achieved nothing. Don't end up like that, okay? Stick to pick a couple of backout dates, like I've suggested on the slide here, and stick to them. One more thing to say about the sticking to a backout date, though, is of course do it nicely, do it politely, with lots of warning shots to your ES and your QIP lead and your departmental leads or anyone else who's involved in the process of choosing that QIP. You know, they're going to want you to complete it. They're going to be hoping you're going to do that work. If you just turn up out of the blue saying, mic drop, I'm out of here, I'm not doing this anymore, that's going to ruffle a lot of feathers. Make sure that you're communicating well in advance what your SMART goals are, what your timelines are, so that when the day comes that you come saying, this is not progressing and I want to stop, they've had so much advance notice that this should not be a surprise to anybody in your department. Okay, but assuming that you have found a topic that that everybody agrees is viable and you're happy to commit to, then here's how you get started. The first phase is to do a lot of work, spend a few weeks understanding and defining the problem. And there's two specific simultaneous streams that you need to have in mind while you're doing this. What's going on and who matters. And they're both as important as each other. So, analysis of what's really going on involves developing a process diagram and identifying where there may be points in that diagram that you will start to think about using as data points for you to collect as you run your project. You're also gathering information on what people think. Probably, if it's a problem that the department thinks is important, chances are somebody's tried to tackle it before and it didn't work. You want to know what those efforts were and what you can learn from it. Read online. A lot of DEDs have the same challenges, so you may well be able to find QIP reports online, particularly with the BMJ, Quality and Safety journals. And there's a quality hub where there's lots of QIP reports filed. Go look at those, that's really essential. And then you spend a bit of time watching what's happening. So let's say your project involves something to do with giving a treatment to a patient or getting something done by a specific time. Well, you need to find this kind of patient or the patient who's presenting with the problem you're interested in and follow them. Try and pick up a couple of those patients as your own on shift and see what happens. And do a few, because there's always complexities to it that you're not going to pick up with the first one. Maybe on a non-clinical day, do a little bit of preliminary pilot audit work. Find out how you can identify these patients, because you're going to need that in the future, and take a look through the notes. And through all the intelligence you gather, through following, through notes, and also through talking to staff, build a process map. And here's what a process map looks like. Now, this is a relatively complex one. This was for patients presenting with features suggesting they're at high risk of sepsis and need an antibiotic. You know, the classic antibiotic in an hour for sepsis. So patients can arrive by ambulance or to the front door. They could be directed to resus or go to majors or even sit in the waiting room, depending on conditions. The triage nurse might identify it, or they might not, and it's somebody else. Then you need a process of a nurse assessment, somebody doing bloods in a cannula, a doctor going and seeing the patient, writing a prescription, and eventually the drug delivered. These are all checkpoints on your process map. A simpler one that we're working on right now is to improve the frequency with which our team documents handover properly. And that will be very simple. You know, doctor realizes it's time to go home. Doctor wants to hand over, doctor finds a colleague, doctor explains, they write a note between them. And the note is adequate. So that's a very simple linear process map. But you must do a process map, because it's only by writing the story out and asking why did that happen or not happen that you find there's often loops and additional things happening. And this is very useful surveillance for your project, because you're starting to do the work for figuring out where problems are that you can fix. I'm going to go back to the previous slide, because another thing that you should do as you're doing this preliminary work is write down what your goal and your intended outcome is, roughly. Is it like 100% of patients with this problem get that treatment? Or is it 90% of patients with this problem get flowed to that area? And write down why it's important. And the reason for that is most problems of any significance in an ED are interrelated with other problems. And as you develop knowledge and engage with people who are interested, people will start to add bits to it. They'll say, well, to solve this, you need to solve that. And your project may find that it's growing and the goals are shifting or expanding to the point that you've got an amount of work that's just not manageable in your time. And the way to resist that unintended growth is to have written down on paper right at the start what your goal is and why. And you can then say to people, well, that's a great idea, but I'm terribly sorry, my goal is this, and that's what I've agreed with the department leads and my ES. It helps you say no to things that you feel you can't do or aren't directly relevant to your project. I would say you revise it after you've finished your project work, but I think it's important to have something written down right at the beginning just to help you keep an eye on really what your aims are. Okay, so now you've got a process map and you've got a clear idea of all the complexities and all the possible different directions or barriers that you're encountering with your problem. That process map now lends itself to maybe 3 or 4 key checkpoints or events or issues that you're going to be able to use to collect data on. And that's called your process data. It's not your outcome, it's a step along the way, but it's a key step. And tracking that step will give you information about whether your future work is being successful or not. Here's an example, and this is the sepsis project again. So obviously with the sepsis project, we chose to track time to a specific event, and what you see here is time to a triage, time to a secondary nursing assessment, I think it was, a doctor's review, and then the issuing of a prescription, and then the completion of the task, the antibiotic given. And with that, we thought that because we thought these are the key things where we're going to intervene, so these are the things we want to track. So there's a lot of pragmatism here, and you can't pick too much. You've got to pick 3 or 4. So you can only choose this once you've really got a solid idea of where you feel the most rich potential targets are for solving your problem. And I would say that with the sepsis project, yes, it was time-based, but many other projects, it might be a frequency count. At this point, only 50% of a thing was done. At this point, 25% was done. At this point, still 25% is done. So that might help you find your particular weak points. It's also going to let you track what you intervene later. And lastly, the value of doing this now is you get an early feel for how easy it is to get this data, because if you can't get the data, you don't have a QIP, right? You've got nothing to submit. You won't get a pass from a project that hasn't got any data in it. So this is an early chance for you to discover whether or not that's actually manageable. Okay, so now you've got an awful lot of information about what the problem is. Departments are busy, and wherever you try to do one thing, it's going to impact an awful lot of other things. People with different interests will then feel you may be impinging on them or supporting them. There's a lot of interest in what goes on in an ED, and you need to manage that. Now, whenever you in your life try and achieve a thing, persuade people to do something, you probably carry around an idea of who matters, who's your supporter, who do you need to persuade because they're against, they're not supportive of your project or actually would resist it. So we do carry these ideas around in our minds. We're just asking that you formalize it on paper. And this is called a stakeholder analysis. It's a 2x2 matrix, and the axes are, the axis on the side is whether the individuals of interest have power to materially affect your project. And some do and some don't. Departmental cleaners might not. Departmental consultants and matrons probably do. But they're all quite interested in actually what's going on in the ED. On the other axis, there's the extent of interest in your project. Now, there's people who have the power to materially influence it, but probably won't, because they're not particularly interested in your project. Like, for example, the executives, or in my case, who else did I put in the not particularly interested but have the power to sway it? I think I put QIP leads in the trust and things like that. The people that you have the power and interest, you need to work hard to make sure they're on your side. The people with high power but low interest, well, they just want to be reassured that the project is important and it's not going to mess up something else. So you need to keep them informed, keep them aware of what's going on, but hopefully you will have to make minimal investment. People who have low power but high interest often actually have higher power than we wish. Like, for example, you might think that in terms of authority, our nursing staff don't have as much authority as the matrons. But if they don't agree with what you're asking a staff nurse to do, they won't prioritize it. So they can often be actually higher power than you think. And I found that there was an awful lot of people in the high power, high interest box and not many people elsewhere. The value of doing it, as I've described, is it lets you decide how methodologically you're going to deal with these groups. And when it comes to writing up the report, this is actually going to form maybe part of your description of your leadership of the project. Thinking about how you brought on side and ensured everybody was in agreement with your project. Here's the example from the sepsis project. In the Keep Satisfied, the high power, low impact, the trust management, the trust quality improvement leads, and the trust sepsis working group. There's an awful lot of EM staff in the high power, high impact box. In the low power, high impact box, well, the most important are patients. Yeah, they don't have much power, but they are very interested in getting the best quality treatment that they can. And often I find it quite difficult to find somebody who's got low power and low interest, but is still relevant to the project. Likewise, who has high and low interest might change depending on the specific interventions you decide to do. So in a sense, it's a bit artificial to ask you to write down a single stakeholder analysis, because it might change as your project develops. But we only ask you to write it down once, because, I mean, it only has so much value to ask you to do it more times. The force field analysis. Now, this isn't mandatory, it's not necessary, but I find it opened my eyes, actually, so it was a useful exercise for my project. It's very subjective, and it just gives you an idea in the end of how easy or difficult it's going to be to implement your project. You just think of every factor that might be a barrier culturally or logistically, that might be a barrier to your project or might be a support and an aid to your project. And you grade them 1 to 5. Just what you think. And then you literally add them up. And it gives you an idea of all the sort of relevant factors that are going to oppose your project and all the relevant factors that are going to support your project. And it can be eye-opening actually once you start doing it. So thinking naively that everyone's going to love the idea of rapid antibiotics that's going to save lives, what I realised was there was an awful lot of opposing forces. The most important of which was how invested the trust was in the 4-hour target and getting patients moved out of the department. So nursing activity was very focused on that. So when I realised that, I thought, oh gosh, there's going to be a lot of challenge to the project. And there's mine there. So I came out on balance with there were more forces against change than for change by a fine margin. And again, it gives you it's just a different way of looking at the whole project, the whole problem, that oftentimes will bring ideas to the forefront or help you realize where your most rich targets are. Now, it's worth going back and just double checking that the scope of the problem hasn't really changed with all this analysis. So reaffirm your target, and actually in terms of a specific target like X% or within a Y time. And there you are. First phase is done. The next phase is developing solutions. So phase 2, developing solutions. When the slide will move. There we go. Right, there's 2 key parts to this. The Ishikawa chart and the driver diagram. The first is an aid to help you brainstorm out loads of ideas, some of which will be trivial, some of which will be really good. And it starts with just listing down every single problem you can think of. But here's how you organize it, right? So you see the big, more squarish box at the right-hand side. In there, you write your problem. Patients are not getting antibiotics within enough time. We are not documenting handover, that sort of thing. And now, immediately, you'll have a lot of thoughts about barriers that are interacting with the problem. And you need to organize those. So on each of the spines, at the top, write a category. Something relevant. And this is not like the periodic table, right? You put the categories that are relevant to your project. And then underneath it, within each category, you write all of the problems and barriers that you have identified. Oftentimes, you need to do this 3 or 4 times, because as you get started, some of the categories will have very little things in them, and others will grow to have such big long lists that you really need to split it into subcategories. But if you don't know where to start, here's a couple of suggestions for just starting off categories. And one would be all of the checkpoints on your process map. Or another would be the list of P's and T's that you see there, right? So people, proficiency, so skills, place, that might be the geography or the culture, the parts, that's the actual equipment involved. Process and policy are split. So process is actually what happens, and policy is what we're supposed to do. Now, they're often very different, aren't they? And then time. And the second one particularly is really pretty good, and you'll come out with a lot of ideas using that. Sometimes do both, and then put it together into a kind of a final Ishikawa chart. You really want to take a bit of time over it, talk to lots of people, see if other people can add to it. Really come out with as many discrete problems as you can identify. Here's the one that I developed for the sepsis project. There's probably, I think, maybe 24 specific problems identified on that. I think for my one, I used the stages on my process map because it was complex enough. And then what do you do with all that information? Well, you are simply going to reformat it as a first step into the driver diagram. So you can see where you had one box describing your problem in the fishbone diagram, the Ishikawa diagram. Now in the driver diagram, recast that into the intended solution, the intended outcome. And then in the next column, which is multicolored here, put all of the headers from your Ishikawa chart. And then in the third column, you put every single barrier that you could identify linked to the original header in the fishbone diagram. And now you have a fourth empty column. And into that, for every single problem, you write the best discrete solution that you can think of. Sometimes you can think of 3 or 4 different solutions to the same problem. So it doesn't have to be a one-to-one mapping. But use that column to get down every single solution you can think of. Some of them will be terrible. Some of them will be brilliant. But do them all. Because sometimes what looks terrible with your eyes might look like actually quite something easy to do, or quite a good idea with a different viewpoint. So get them all down. Here's just what I've described there. So here's all the organization of the driver diagram. And here's my completed one. Okay, there are other methods to achieve this. Root cause, well, you see the list there on the slide. I have no clue how to use any of those because the combination of Ishikawa and driver diagram is very powerful. I just have no need of any of the others. And they lend themselves to different types of projects. So do go take a look. If you feel you've got something that this structure isn't working, then go take a look at them. They may be more useful to you and the particular project that you're trying to implement. Okay, so far so good. You've gone from knowing nothing to knowing what's going on, the whole scope of the problem, lots of potential solutions to the project, and you've got a pretty clear idea of who might support you and oppose you in it. There's one last thing you need to really think about before you're really ready to get going, and that is data types. So we've already talked about your outcome measure, whether that's time-based or frequency-based, or well, we'll come on to it a little bit later. There are other methods as well, depending on your project. Process, we've talked about as well. These are intermediate steps in the process. There are very few projects out there that don't have a suitable process step. They virtually all do. Sometimes you've just got to think a bit harder or a bit laterally to identify them, but they are there. And they help you. It's worth the investment. But thirdly, wherever you do something in an emergency department, it's probably going to impact other things going on. And we have a responsibility to actually think hard about what those things might be and measure them to ensure that we're not doing more harm than good overall. And that's called balancing measures. And we really expect that every QIP will that in every QIP all 3 data types will be measured. For your outcome, I mean, you may have a problem that occurs frequently, and the dream is to have at least 10 patients a week presenting with this problem, or 10 events a week. That makes your life really easy. You can gather data, therefore, really fast between interventions. That makes your life easy. However, you may have been given something a bit more challenging, or taken something a bit more challenging, or that's rare, like I mean, the one I can think of that a colleague did was, how frequently do we get it right prescribing all the medications for patients with Parkinson's disease? Well, we don't get that many in the ED. So even if you audit them all, there's not that many. And if you're trying to accumulate enough to measure your interventions, you are just not going to get enough for frequency counts. So an alternative solution for that kind of a problem is called time between events. So how frequently do we get it wrong? Do we get it wrong with every patient? Well, hopefully after you've done a bit of intervention work, we'll get it right some of the time and wrong some of the time, which means there'll be longer intervals between events where we get it wrong. And as you work on your project and all your colleagues get better at managing that thing, time between failures gets longer and longer and longer. So your run chart measures time between failures. So from each event, as time goes on, is it every day there's an error? Is it every week there's an error? Every month there's an error? And so that's how you describe the data in a chart. For educational or well-being type projects, it might be Likert scales, or again, it might be frequency counts. It just depends on your project. But I like to remind you, if you don't have data, you don't have a QIP, and you can't submit a QIP without data. And how much data do you need? Well, the only time I've ever heard any statement from FRCEM was in 2018. I went to a seminar there, and it was presented by one of the committee who had been heavily involved in switching from CTRs to QIPs. And he said, the minimum expected is 30 patients' records audited pre-intervention. So your baseline data is 30. And then after you do each intervention, a minimum of 10. So that's where the typical case where you've got fairly frequent problems. If you are measuring rare presentations and you're doing the time between events, that analysis only works if you are reliably able to capture them all. So you have to capture them all. And I would say nobody's really come forward and given us numbers for educational QIPs. Ideally, similar sort of numbers as for the usual case patient problem. Or it might be that you are doing a smaller group but measuring them all. I think one thing to reassure you though is that QIP is really intended in its core to be pragmatic, suitable for your department. So as long as your educational supervisor and your department's QIP lead agree something different from these numbers, and you can justify that, then that's okay. That's perfectly acceptable. You might have an intermediate frequency of problem where realistically you're only going to be able to capture 5 between one cycle and the next cycle. Well, if that's all that there is available, but you agree that it's an important project, well, absolutely, you justify it in your report at the end, and that's absolutely acceptable. I really want to emphasize that it's not research. QIP is pragmatic, and when you can justify your decisions, that's okay. A last thought about the preparation phase is gathering a team. They're always asked to comment on the team you gathered and the reasons you had for allocating them the roles that they did. Well, my experience is I was a team of 1, right? And But I would find that people would come along with an interest in the specific thing that I was dealing with, and they would do a bit to help. Well, they are my team. It doesn't have to be the same people from beginning to end. And why did I allocate them? Well, that's because that's what they said they were willing to do for me. You know, if you can find a couple of people who will help you with data, that's just wonderful, and it makes your life easy to sort of explain that sort of process. Usually, though, you're being a motivator, trying to get people to help you, and that's okay. Don't sweat that stuff. So phase 2 is almost complete, and almost all of the hard work. I think by the time you got to this point, things are going to get a lot easier because you're so familiar with your project and your problem now. So the next step is to get together with your stakeholders. Don't do this by yourself. You need the buy-in, right? You need the department's leads to agree that what you're doing is the right thing to do. Well, the only way to achieve that is to involve them in the decision-making process at the start. So engaging with your stakeholders, pick the best three solutions, maybe 4 solutions, so you've got one in the backup, as a backup. And once you know the solutions you're going to do, that's the point that you can say, well, this individual solution is probably going to create a problem over here, so their balancing measure will have to be to track that thing. So only once you know what you're actually going to do, you can come up with a balancing measure, right? So this is where you identify your balancing measures. And spoiler alert, there are always balancing measures. The data type, though, might be quite different. Where for your outcome and your process, it's usually quite easy to define. Where it causes harm or problems can often be harder to track. It might be sort of nebulous delays or confusions or something like that. So consider it might have to be questionnaire data or you know, sort of a change in process time or something like that. It might be quite different to your other data. Okay, phase 2 is complete. Time to think about implementing the change. And have another cup of tea. Okay, I think we talked through all of that, didn't we? When you start implementing your proposed interventions, the belief is it's going to be this smooth, continuous process and it's all going to run brilliantly. It's rarely like that, okay? You and your stakeholders, involved people, will make a plan, you're ready to go, and then somebody goes on annual leave. Or some other new process is introduced that means that you have to delay. And the other key thing is what you imagine will be an implementation at a specific time point often is messy and takes quite a while to roll out. You've got to communicate to different staff groups on different days or different shifts. Or there's procurement problems, or there's a delay, or a cable didn't get delivered. All sorts of reasons why it's not just a clear start point. For this reason, it's really important that at this point you start keeping a very solid diary of events. Because 2 months down the line, when you're trying to remember exactly what happened, you'll be amazed at how hard it is. Did this thing happen because of that, or is it vice versa? If you don't track it, you will struggle to remember. And of course, where your data was recorded, if it doesn't look like it aligns with actually when your implementation was completed, then your data becomes questionable. So you've got to be very, very clear about saying, well, I'm starting to intervene or starting to roll out my intervention now, and I will say that my rollout is complete when. So you need to define a time point when you'll say that I have completed the rollout. And there's probably a couple of kind of data points that will tell you when you've done it, or it might be by Friday I will have spoken to 63% of the department, or the posters will be up, or the build is complete, or whatever it is, right? You need to identify that time point really clearly, and then make sure you don't start collecting any subsequent data until actually it genuinely is subsequent to your rollout. It's very easy to have them overlap, and that means that you've not completed your implementation, so your data is not measuring what is actually, what you hope it's measuring. And again, then once you've got, it's often, and the other key thing is it's really tempting to start rolling out the next implementation, the next cycle, the next solution, before you've really looked at your data from your first implementation. And that gets really messy then, so avoid that. Now again, like I said, the dream, the ideal QIP is just kind of continuously sampling X number of patients every week, so you get a continuous flow of data. And that would give you what's called a run chart like this, a graph that is just tracking through time your outcome measure. Your process data also can be tracked the same way usually. Here is a chart that was drawn for the sepsis project I described earlier, and at the left hand side you've got time zero, you've got what I think it's the mean time to an antibiotic is up well over 2 hours, and the blue line is the outcome, and you see that come down. But I also charted all my process measures on the same chart, and you can see that they also converge down as I did specific things at specific times to target particular parts of the process. Also on the chart you can see I've put 3 orange arrows that shows where the time that I implemented my interventions. But here's the trouble, right? That an intervention doesn't just happen on one day at one time. It's spread over a week or something like that. And it'd be better, it genuinely be better and more coherent for you interpreting your chart later if you track it as a period of time where I was implementing where I was rolling out my thing. And the end period where you say I have completed my rollout, that's defined on your run chart too. I'd strongly recommend you do that. And the last thing to note, I think we'll mention it on another chart. Yeah, exactly here. So the ideal QIP tracks the same number of patients every week, like the chart on the left. But that's not going to be you. Remember I said if you've got a fairly common problem, then you're going to do minimum 30 baseline, and then stop auditing patients while you roll out your intervention. So there's going to be a gap. Then you'll do 10, and there'll be a bit more data, and then there'll be another gap, and then a bit more data. And so your chart's more likely to end up looking like the one on the right. And I would say, don't just do the first 10. Yeah, because then all you end up is one time point with some data after it. You want a line, so I would say to audit maybe 5 per week or per day, depending on how your data collection is going. And if you have time between events, then your line definitely should be continuous. Because like I said, you've got to audit them all. And that can only work if you really know how you're gathering your data. Oh, we already talked about this, didn't we? Don't need to skip that over again. And that. And we'll cut to this important message. Don't leave data analysis to the end. It's tempting just to bash on and just roll out one and then the next and then the next intervention and then collect all the data at the end. but just don't. Do collect and analyze the data in real time after each discrete intervention. Number one, because if you're lucky, your first intervention, which is you probably picked as the best or most likely to succeed, may well have fixed the problem. In which case you don't need to do any more interventions. You probably do need to re-audit it after a short period of time to make sure that your fix stayed fixed, right? But you might not need to do any more PDSA cycling at all. But equally, if you roll out what you think is going to be the very best solution, and you discover that there was zero response at all, then you might think something has gone wrong with the implementation. That the idea that this is the point in the process to target might still be right, but the solution you dreamed up failed for some reason, in which case it might be better to go back to the drawing board and think of another way to target this point in the process. So for those two reasons, do discipline yourself. It doesn't take that much time, or it shouldn't, because you figured out a method for getting data that should be realistic and practical. Just do the measurements. Honestly, your life will be so much better. And when to stop doing this cycling process of intervention, analyze, think about what you're going to do next, do the next intervention. When do you stop? Well, that's the act bit of the PDSA cycle. What are you going to do next once you've got your final data set, or your most recent data set? Well, obviously, when you achieve your target, it's time to stop. But you do need to re-audit it, as I said, to make sure that it stays fixed. Or it might be that you've done a couple of interventions and the feedback shows you that this problem is not going to be something that you can solve. There comes a point where there's no point going on any further. And at that point, you would go back to the department leads and say, look, we tried, but the evidence is that the ideas we had isn't going to work for X and Y reasons. If you're doing an FRCEM QIP, stop after 3, because you shouldn't get any credit for any more than 3 cycles, because we don't want people feeling like they've got to go on and on and on and on. The project's meant to be a 6-month period at most. So 3 cycles and you're out. And don't worry too much if you haven't achieved a change. I'll come back to that in the end. Just a note to say, don't waste your time with statistics. There are actual ways out there to look at a run chart, analyze it and say, we can say statistically this intervention had a significant effect. But there's no point. Number one, because you and your team and your department have decided what success is before you even got started. So you don't need statistics to tell you what success is now. You're more pragmatic than that. And secondly, that same old adage, statistical significance does not equate to clinical significance. So it's very rarely worth it, and you don't get any credit when you're submitting an FRCEM report. I have used statistics in one QIP project though that I used, because we ran a pilot study. So it was very small scale, and we wanted at the end to be able to say, well, did the pilot work, even though we didn't expect a massive impact? And so I used the statistics that's linked to here to say, yes, the pilot did have a statistically significant impact. Now let's go and run a bigger trial. You find it by web searching the IHI run chart rules there. You just web search that, you'll find it. And there you are. By the time you get to here, you will have implemented maybe 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 PDSA cycles. I think for FRCEM we expect at least 2, unless you can show amazing success with your first one. But we'd still expect you to be telling us what you had planned your second one to be and your third one. So the next phase is writing up the report. Ah, this tea's gone cold. Right, writing the report, and whether you're listening to this talk or actually at this point in your project, either way, you'd be forgiven for feeling like a bit of a dead dog at this point. Okay, everybody does. It's exhausting. It's very hard work. But you're almost there, right? There's only a few slides to go. Okay, it can feel difficult writing the report if you try and write it like a scientific report, because that's what you're probably most familiar with reading. It'll be natural. You think, oh, introduction, methods and results in the discussion. It just doesn't seem to work like that, because you need to write the report like a narrative, because oftentimes what you did at point X was influenced by what you had discovered previous to that. So it's very hard to write all of the methods in one section and then all of the results, because the initial results will influence what you did in the later methods. So it just doesn't work. Honestly, it just doesn't work. So write it like a narrative, and I'll show you on the next slide the headers that I used. One thing to say is, do keep evidence. Meeting minutes, at least the tasks that were agreed at the end of the meeting, the action tracker. Keep copies of important emails where things were agreed, that sort of thing, and that can go into an appendix, a supporting evidence that you were the leader of this QIP. Here's the chapter titles that forms the basis of a QIP report. Do a little summary, and again, it's a mini narrative, but it's just got the key headlines. So think like a 300-word abstract, but again, it's a slightly more narrative than a scientific abstract. Then give a clinical vignette and why you chose the problem, and then a context about the emergency department that you work in, and a context of the particular problem that you're trying to solve, which would include literature reviews and reviews of previous attempts to fix it. Then you describe all your assessment work, your process map, your stakeholder diagram, your Ishikawa chart, and your driver diagram. An explanation, a justification for all the data types that you selected to use. Describe your team, and then a bit of a narrative about how you implemented the change, but really the rationale for why you chose those comes first. So planning, actually implementing the change is quite a short section, right? And then results, conclusions, and reflection. And it is important in the reflection section to discuss what went well, what you found difficult, and a bit of your learning of the leadership role. And then, as I said, appendices with evidence. Now, of course, for FRCEM submission, the text is written on the QIAT form, and you can't, at least at the time that I'm doing this talk, you can't embed diagrams into it. So you have to create a folder in your ePortfolio and put all of your supporting evidence into that folder, and then reference it in your QIAT. This is the only information the college has published to guide you on what's expected. There's no formal marking scheme in there, but it does tell you the expected elements. So please do go web search this and read it. Back in 2020, when I did mine, there was a formal marking scheme. Now, it has been declared obsolete. Very officially, it's no longer in use. However, it is still available online to download the 2020 marking scheme, and I do recommend you go and have a look at it, because I think although it's obsolete and it's not going to be used to mark your QIP, you'll see that that there's descriptors of what's a clear pass and what's a borderline pass, and if you make sure that your project meets those descriptors in all of the domains, you are sure to pass. Okay. Now, I wanted to finish up with a few thoughts on choosing a suitable project, because I've seen colleagues over the years, and I personally probably screwed up or chose unwisely a couple of projects in ST4 and ST5, so that when I got to ST6, I absolutely had to produce a passable QIP, or I was looking at an extension of my training. So what I learned, and what I've learned from other people's difficulties as well, is there are certain things that can really derail you. And here's some considerations here. So I'm actually not going to start on the top, but I would say it is advisable to ensure that you're doing a project on a problem that presents itself in the ED frequently. And I would suggest 10 times a week or 10 times a fortnight would be what I'd call frequent, or the minimum, because that lets you collect data and move on quickly. If you are struggling to get data, you're kind of stuck between cycling, and the length of your project is getting longer, and it's going to be harder to bring it over the line before your ERCP date. If you want to go for something rare and you're going to use the time between events method of analysis, make sure that you can capture enough data before you commit to it. Does the department consider it's an important topic? That's very important. It would be very hard to make headway if enough leaders in your department, enough consultants and the department leads and enough matrons, if enough people don't agree that this is important, you're really on your own. Then it's going to be very hard to get things progressed efficiently. So you've got a QIP lead, there'll be probably like a quality and safety lead, and you've got a department lead. And if these people together agree it's an important project, get that written down in emails, then you have got all the support to really progress your project confidently. Can you collect the data yourself if you need to? This is an absolute must. It's lovely if you've got a team of worker bees that will do it for you. Absolutely amazing if the audit office will do it for you. But as a fallback, you must be able to know that you can collect the data yourself, because if you haven't got any data, you haven't got a QIP you can submit. So don't commit to a project until you know that you can acquire that data, if everything else falls apart. Is your project exciting and ambitious? Well, danger signals there, because if it's really novel, then lots of committees get involved. They want to consider whether it's appropriate and safe, and lots of people want to join in, but then they'll bring their goals, their ideas to it, and for both of these reasons, it can delay progress to the extent that people have had to sort of walk away from departments and go pick up something else somewhere else. Does it depend on external groups? That is potentially disastrous, because what if your external group just doesn't get a move on in the kind of time period that you need? If they don't, you are sunk, and you've got no way of controlling or forcing the issue. So be very, very wary of doing anything that isn't managed directly within the ED. I remember a colleague trying to get a virtual fracture clinic set up a few years ago in a hospital that didn't have one, and I'm sure it's up and running now, but in the year that he was there, he invested so much effort into it, but there wasn't a single fracture clinic up and running by the time that he left, which meant there was no data and no QIP for him to submit, so he had to go do something else after a huge amount of work. And remember, like I said before, that bias called the sunk cost fallacy. When we invest in something, we want to keep going with it. We keep on telling ourselves, it'll work out if I just keep going. There comes a point where you've got to bail. And can you actually make a successful change? Coming back to the top question, well, it's not essential. QIP marking is a bit like the maths exams that you did in high school, right? If you show you're working, you'll get most of the marks even if you don't have the right answer. So you can easily pass a QIP without having managed to achieve an intervention. But let's say your QIP is borderline on all the difficulties and complexities, you know, that it got messy, and what you submit in the end is a borderline report. Well, in that case, if you succeed in making the change that you were targeting, then it's very hard to mark you down. But if you didn't manage to achieve your target, then you didn't manage to achieve any change, then it's much easier for examiners to scrutinize and criticize your methods. Yeah? And also, if you really believe I can actually do this and it'll be a good thing for patients or staff, whatever, it's going to be more motivating than taking a project you don't believe you can achieve anything with. So, if you have options, take the one where you actually believe you could change something. Oops, going backwards, sorry. Come on, okay. And then the last couple of comments. And I think I alluded to this at the beginning, that, you know, you will be one day a consultant and you will be given problems that you don't know how to fix. And what I've described here are a set of very useful tools that you can tackle that problem with. If instead of taking a project with a problem, you take a project where the solution is already planned out and somebody wants you just to roll with it, well, the chances are you don't need to do all this work, and you will not be training yourself how to solve a problem you don't know how to solve. So we all know that there are ways that you can take a project that's starting with a solution and dress it up like it's a problem-based project. But you're really selling yourself short if you take a project like that. And my advice is that, you know, when you're picking between potential projects, take the hard choice and take the project that you don't know how to solve. You will get support. Your ES is there to discuss things with, the QI lead in your department. You'll be training yourself better for your future. And the last thing I've already mentioned in the last slide, it's that small school maths exam idea. You will, even if you don't manage to make a change, don't sweat that stuff. You can still easily pass just by demonstrating that you can follow the recipe. It's nice if you can get a QIP that looks good on your CV. It doesn't have to be something massive or dramatic. Small but well thought out will get you a lot of respect. Now, this is all recorded. You can't ask questions now, I'm afraid, but there's my email address. Please feel free to send me questions you have, particularly if you think there was something that could have been said more clearly in the talk, or if you've got a QIP that you're thinking about doing but not sure if it's a suitable QIP, and I'll be glad to advise you. Here are, and I'll hopefully get these up on the VLE along with this talk, some links to some useful documents and some useful tools that, templates, that you can use to build Ishikawa charts, driver diagrams, that sort of thing. And that's me done. Well done for sticking through the whole hour and 18 minutes or whatever it's been. I wish you all the very best, and I'll see you around. Bye-bye.